electrify everything. By that I mean they would buildings would move off of natural gas and onto electricity. Transportation would be electrified through plug-in vehicles. They also assumed that they would totally wean themselves from fossil fuels in transportation, that they would go to some biofuels, or it would be totally electrified otherwise. And then, if in fact there were any use of fossil fuels like natural gas, that would include carbon storage and sequestration, carbon capture and sequestration, even though the technology to do that doesn't presently exist. And even with those assumptions, they, under the yellow scenario, could not get to 80%. They could only get to about 56% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So they took it a step further in the deep blue and the ultraviolet, and you can see in both scenarios some significant changes. They went, they started to look more and more towards the use of nuclear, and in the ultraviolet scenario, you'll see a 35% increase in nuclear, which would mean 10 to 12 new plants. And then in the deep blue, they went to 2 new plants. And then in addition to that, under the deep blue scenario, they went completely with the light-duty vehicles, completely with hydrogen, 100% hydrogen, which I'm told, and maybe Skiles, you can elaborate on this, again, would take smaller nuclear reactors to produce that hydrogen. So they made some pretty dramatic assumptions to get them to that 80% reduction. But those other 2 scenarios do get there. And if you're interested in this visioning exercise, you can go to nyclimatechange.us, and the visioning paper is available there. And I offer this not because it can be rather sobering, but rather to underscore that this is a real challenge. When you start looking out to 2050, and you're looking at an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, obviously that's going to take some fairly dramatic steps, and it's going to require changes in lifestyles and approaches. Frankly, it's going to take development of technologies that today simply don't exist. And so it's a very, very, very much a challenge. It's one that we need to move forward on, but it is going to be something that is really going to test our mettle. So with that, Mike, that's my last slide, and then I'm done there. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're going to follow up here with Tom Looby. And as I at least alluded to earlier, Tom is a senior project manager with the Center for Climate Strategies. He's the one who held our hand through the whole Climate Action Council process to develop the State Climate Action Plan. He comes very, very well credentialed. He's a former commissioner with the Colorado Office of the Environment with the Department of Public Health and Environment. And he's also one of the founders of the Environmental Council of States, which is, among other things, kind of an advocacy group, for the states, especially in their interaction with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So he's got plenty of experience in there. And in addition to Michigan, he's been moving on, working with numerous other states for this whole climate action plan development process and adaptation. So with that, Tom?
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be back here. You didn't mention that I'm an MSU grad, so when I had the opportunity to come back and be part of this, I jumped at the chance, as I did with the opportunity to help facilitate the Michigan climate process. So it's always great to be home in Michigan and back on the campus. I'm going to cover 3 basic areas today. First, some of the state climate planning efforts that have been going on throughout the country, particularly the ones that the Center for Climate Strategies has been involved in. I'll touch briefly on some of the regional initiatives that exist around the United States. and some in conjunction with Canadian provinces. And then I want to spend a few minutes talking about a national scale-up of selected state policy options that the Center for Climate Strategies has conducted, and we just released a new version of it actually last Friday, so I'll hit on some of the highlights of it as well. In terms of the states, the slide here depicts the states that have put together climate action plans of one kind or another. The dark blue ones have plans completed. There's several that are underway in a lighter blue. These plans have been done in 32 states. CCS has been involved. We're working in New York and Kentucky right now, so that makes, I think, 23 that we've been the facilitators for. These plans cover two-thirds of the U.S. economy and population. And half of the greenhouse gas emissions that occur in the United States are covered by these plans. All sectors of the economy are included in them, and through these processes in 20-plus states, we have developed over 900 specific policy options that are very implementable in most circumstances. And in a handful of states, we've also gone to the step that Steve described of doing a macroeconomic study to talk about the impacts to both employment and the economy in the state. During the course of these planning processes, we've engaged over 1,500 stakeholders. And each of there's almost always a gubernatorially appointed or an executive director, cabinet level appointed council that steers the whole process and makes a lot of the decisions, but they are supported by what we referred to as the technical work groups that Steve mentioned, and there's often 10 to 25 technical experts in those various sectors that are advisory to the council and help actually develop and design the policy options. When we got started on this, people would sometimes ask, why would you bother doing this? The United States government, the Congress, needs to take the lead on this. Well, when you look at the greenhouse gas emissions from states, we find that there are 30 of the top 75 emitters of greenhouse gases in the world. And this slide depicts, and you can barely see it, but the nations are in blue and the states are in red, and you can see that there's China, Russia, Japan, India, and then Texas in terms of gross emitters, and then it goes on from there. But when you accumulate all of those greenhouse gas emissions, it is a significant contributor to world greenhouse gas emissions. I'm not going to go through this. This is a busy slide, but the essence of this is that in each of these states that or provinces that have participated in these planning processes, they've all set greenhouse gas reduction goals and targets. And there's usually a short-term, a mid-term, and a long-term target that they utilize. We have tried to quantify the short and mid-term targets, and the long-term targets are usually in the 2040, 2050 range, so we don't pretend to be able to make credible estimates that far out in these planning processes. This slide just captures the essence of some of the goals and the reductions and the savings and the job gains from those states that we've done economic studies on. The column I want to point out is the degree of unanimity column, the third one there, right there. Florida did beat Michigan, unfortunately. Steve, in Florida they did wind up with unanimous consent on the whole package. But by and large, what happens in these processes is you get unanimous consent on the vast majority of options. And then there's usually a few that may not have unanimous support. We call it a supermajority when you just have one or two objectors. But most often you have a very high level of consensus that's developed through these participative processes that yields a high level of consensus because people were engaged in the design of the options. So at the regional level, there's 3 different entities that exist in the United States, plus we did an assessment in the South. So you've got the northeastern states, the western states, the southern study, and the Midwest Governors Association greenhouse gas accord. I'll just hit a couple highlights from each of them. In the northeastern states, it was focused on electric power generation and had a mandatory CO2 reduction program. They targeted 10% reduction from 2009 by 2018. In the Western Climate Initiative, got many of the western states and some Canadian provinces involved. It's a multi-sector proposal. It has a target of 15% reduction from 2005 levels by 2020. There's a lot of political controversy about climate change in the West going on these days. Arizona's withdrawn from the cap and trade part of the program, and other states are having lots of political debate about it right now. The Midwest Governors Greenhouse Gas Accord involved these 6 states plus the Canadian province, and it's a multi-sector proposal also. It has 20% reduction from 05 levels by 2020 and has been reviewed by the member states. In addition, we did an assessment of greenhouse gases for the Southern Governors Association, and we focused on 23 major mitigation options that have a high potential of reducing greenhouse gases. And the individual states are doing follow-up. North Carolina is doing some follow-up, and we're currently working in Kentucky. So I mentioned the scale-up of policy options. What would it look like if we took the majority of these options and applied them nationally? What the Center for Climate Strategies has done is taken the most effective options in these 16 states that are marked with the star, and we basically did a modeling effort to identify what the reductions and costs would be on a national basis if these were applied nationally. The study has 3 scenarios. I'm just going to focus on the first one, but the first one is just taking those policy options, 23 policy bundles we call them, and doing the economic analysis of it. But we also did it for a couple of additional scenarios, being that first stakeholder-based target plus the U.S. Senate cap and trade initiative that's being discussed and likely to be introduced. It might even be introduced today, if I remember that right. And then the third scenario is taking the Senate target for greenhouse gas reductions and cap and trade and a fuel tax and implement it equally but not beyond the economy-wide target set in the Senate bill. I'm not going to try and summarize the second and third scenario. It's just focused on the legislation, but I did want to hit some highlights from the first scenario based upon the options coming out of the state plans. As I mentioned, over 1,500 stakeholders in these states have been involved in these. It's a formal consensus building process, and it's a balanced, comprehensive portfolio approach. One of the key messages that we find is that if everybody is contributing to getting the reductions, you have a lot higher likelihood of getting consensus and success. And so a package needs to be balanced, and it needs to have a lot of consensus. So 90% of all of the emission reduction potential of the 900 plus policy options are covered in this analysis. And the extrapolation to the remaining 34 states has a lot of assumptions involved in it, and those are all described in detail in the report. I'll show you where you can get a copy of that or get linked to it in a few minutes. And it's a national aggregation analysis of these options, but you can also disaggregate it back the other way if you want to look at different regions of the country. So the 23 options include, in the heat and power sector, renewable portfolio standard, nuclear, carbon capture and sequestration and reuse, coal plant efficiency improvements and repowering, the DSM programs in the residential, commercial, and industrial sector, high-performance buildings, appliance standards, building codes, and combined heat and power. In the transportation sector, it's the vehicles, the renewable fuels, smart growth and land use, transit systems, anti-idling technologies, and truck-to-rail shift of mode of transportation mode. In the what we call the AFW, Ag, Forestry, and Waste Management sector, it's crop production, manure management, forest retention, reforestation and afforestation, urban forestry initiatives, municipal solid waste, recycling, and landfill gas management. Those are the 23 different options that were analyzed. This is, I think, the important results. If you look at the compilation of these, you can see that it brings us below the 6 billion metric tons of CO2 equivalent from the 1990 levels. Each of these sectors is depicted in a different color, and we can bring it down well below the 1990 greenhouse gas reduction levels with implementation of these on a national basis. Another version of that chart, this one also happens to depict what's in the proposed Senate bill, which basically takes us to the 1990 targets. Implementation of all of these 23 options would get us well below that level. So the macroeconomic analysis indicated that in 2020, these 23 sector actions at full-scale implementation across the country would result in over 3 billion metric tons of CO2 equivalent reduction, a savings to the economy of $5 billion, 2.5 million additional or net new jobs, and over 130 billion of GDP improvement in 2020. We used the REMI model to do this analysis. We've got a number of technical experts, and we've teamed up with them to do the modeling. It clearly indicates that there's cost-effective ways to accomplish these kinds of reductions. There's additional inputs related to the national price mechanism that would be utilized for the electricity industrial sectors if there's a cap-and-trade program. And the jobs, income, and economic growth and prices are all part of this analysis. These are kind of busy slides, but basically I think Steve showed you for Michigan, this is the zero cost level, so anything that's on this side below the zero level is a marginal cost savings. These are the options that would actually have a cost to implementation, and as you can see, there's a number of options available that can yield the savings to the economy. The next few slides are simply the breakout of that that's got the actual costs and cost per ton reductions, or the cost per ton associated with the reductions that would occur from these different policy options. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those, but they are available. So that's the transportation and land use sector. You can see again where there's the negative cost that entails a savings by implementation. And as Steve mentioned for Michigan, it's not surprising that in this case, all of the options in the energy efficiency arena are cost savings. The energy supply sector, there are costs associated with most of those options. And then when you net it all out is when you get the marginal cost curve that depicts both the savings and the costs. So again, the results from this scenario 1 analysis are the $3 billion savings, the 3 billion metric tons of reductions in greenhouse gases, the 2.5 million jobs, 134 billions of gain in the economy, and a $5 billion net direct cost savings. And the other interesting feature of it is, you can see from these bullets, that there's a net impact of a reduction of consumer energy prices over this time period. They're fairly small, but they would entail net reductions. So the bottom line is that we think with implementation of these kinds of options, you can have an improvement in the economy. There's a reduction in energy prices that are possible. It's important to do this, to have stakeholder engagement in the design of them, and it's important also that you not focus on any one sector of the economy, that it needs to be a comprehensive portfolio of options. And just another slide to depict the level of government, the governance. As you can see from this slide, these options entail both shared local and state options, primary options being implemented at the state level, and then shared federal and state options. The point of this is everyone needs to be in the game, working together in partnerships in order to have this kind of result. I'm going to do a disclaimer here. I'm not the author of this economic analysis, nor am I an economist, but these are the guys and ladies that were involved intimately in it. If you want to learn more about the report, you can go to our website, climatestrategies.us, and it's posted up there, I think, as of today. So there's resources. All of these folks are great resources about the study, particularly Tom Peterson. He's one of the most expert gurus in climate economics in the country, and I think Steve's had the chance to see that firsthand, as a number of you have. In any case, that is a recap of what's happening at the national level. Obviously, the Congress will be determining whether or not to establish a federal program or just depend upon the existing authorities of EPA and the other federal agencies to move forward with what they can do with existing authority. One of the things that we get out of these analyses is that cap and trade helps to move this along, but it's not essential. There are a number of things that we can do without cap and trade. I think the cap and trade and the gas tax add additional opportunity, but there's a lot that states can do and that the country can do without having the cap and trade legislation. Thank you very much.
Okay, our next speaker is going to be Frank Edowagishik. As I mentioned earlier, Frank was our tribal representative on the Michigan Climate Action Council, and he is the current executive director of the United Tribes of Michigan. He's a member of the Little Traverse Band of Ottawa Indians up in the Petoskey area. Is that right? And he's been involved in just about every organization in the state, from what I could gather. Groups like the Great Lakes Resources Committee, Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council, Michigan Indian Education Council. Back in an early life, Frank was a potter, and he's come an awful long way since then. He's very, very active also in the National Congress of American Indians, and the list just goes on and on. If there is ever a face of the 12 sovereign tribes in Michigan, Frank is it. And as a result, he gets pulled into just about every meeting that germinates now and in the future. So we're very fortunate to have him. Frank is going to be giving the tribal perspective, obviously. And with that,
Good morning. I'm going to draw pictures in your minds instead of on the screen. I was involved on the Climate Action Council, and you've heard a good deal about what we were doing with that. But I was one of the ones who felt that nuclear power, I couldn't agree. The tribes were very much against. When you don't have a way to store this poison that is extremely harmful to human beings and to the rest of life, until that's solved, we felt that we just couldn't be behind nuclear power. And it wasn't because we felt that it couldn't be operated safely or any of those things. That was one of the issues that was involved in that. And that's one of the reasons that we didn't reach consensus, and we're at that 100% number. And one of the reasons that we did this, and the perspective that I helped bring to this, is from some of our traditional teachings within the Anishinaabe or the Indian culture here in Michigan and in the Great Lakes. We're taught to look at and consider the consequences of our actions through a time period long enough to encompass 7 generations. So that's our long-range plan. And I like to think about that as not being sort of a specified distance in front of us that we sort of achieve, but it's more like driving down the road at night and having your headlights shining ahead of you. For every 100 yards you go further down the road, your lights go another 100 yards ahead. It's a buffer in front of you. And you need to think those long-range, think in terms of that long-range plan. And that's beyond when most of the people will know our names. It's beyond, most of us can't count back that many generations and name our ancestors at that point. It's a pretty good distance. And it's something that helps to guide our native cultures in terms of how we think about things. And I found that when looking at these issues of importance that a society is moving through, it's helpful because sometimes we look at things and if you have people consider a 5-year plan to be a long-range plan, you make decisions that might not be wise if you were actually looking at